I'm surprised there are any trees left at all in Maryland after hearing these talks this morning, but maybe there are still some. I'm going to be talking about emerald ash borer, which I haven't really worked on until starting last year when I was dragged into it because I really was seeing the impact of it looking on the western shore. Here's a tree, an ash with the characteristic galleries that you see in it. Here's a tree with the canopy gone. So I'm going to be talking about some of the work I've done in wetlands there and that we're trying to spread onto the eastern shore. A grad student working with me, Diane Leeson, she couldn't be here today, but she's really been an active part of this. We're working also with Jonathan Kays, who's here, and Bob Jaden, if any of you guys know him. He's in my department at University of Maryland in College Park. So Andy Baldwin, I'm here. I wanted to thank USDA and the Extension Service are also providing some funding to support Diane so she could go out and get this work started. So we're talking about these tidal swamps again. Tidal freshwater forested wetlands. You might think tides, that equals salt, but many of you know, I'm sure, that a lot of these areas very rarely, if ever, have salt water. They tend to occur in the upper reaches of estuaries. I learned a term about a month ago called cripples. Does anybody know that term? You've heard that? Is that Cripple Creek? Up on Cripple Creek, she sends me. If I spring a lake, she mends me. I hadn't heard that. I thought maybe, but it was you trip over in the swamp and you become a cripple. I don't know. But so the species we're really talking about here is green ash again and pumpkin ash, as Chris was saying, and the others have said. Very, very low salinity. The vegetation is really much more diverse overall than in other more saline systems. And you might look at this map and say, well, geez, that's not very much land. You know, look at this is the eastern shore. Here's this is the Choptank River, Nanticoke River, and that's the Pocomoke River. And they're little green dots on the tributaries of these, but keep in mind that this is 40 kilometers here. So here's a long line. 40 kilometers, about 25 miles. If you zoom in on one of these areas or you try to walk through one of these areas, which is practically impossible, you'll see they're really large, important systems. This is where Sharptown is over here. The Nanticoke main stem river, Marshy Hope Creek comes together. They come together here. There are these little these fringing tidal marshes that you see and say, wow, there are a lot of marshes here when I go up and down the river. But behind the marshes, there are these vast tidal freshwater swamps. Sometimes they get a little bit of salinity, but not very much. And so when you look from the air, you really see how big some of these areas are. More shots of them flying over in a plane. You have this fringing marsh. Also, you see it here. And then the tidal swamp behind it. One of the characteristics of these is that they have this hollow and hummock microtopography. So this is actually in the winter, but these hummocks are sites for different plant species to grow. If it's really shady, you might have nothing growing in these little lower, wetter areas. If the canopy tends to be a little more open, you do get some marsh plants and things like that growing in between them. But that's why they can have so much diversity of plants, is because there's all these different little micro habitats that have different amounts of flooding in them. So they're really interesting systems. And again, I got dragged into this because I was working at this site on the Patuxent River. This is over where Route 4 crosses over the Patuxent River. And I think the fellow from Dorchester County who spoke, he was driving along and he all of a sudden saw this huge dead zone. Well, I was driving along, going to my field site here last spring of 2016. And I said, what happened to the trees? I could see it from the highway. Well, a lot of these trees had died, and I'd been there the year before. Just in that time, there was this sort of massive dieback. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what happened at this particular site. 2015, I go there a lot. This site, it's accessible nearby. There's a little park you can drive off, Patuxent Wetland Park. And there's a marsh, tidal freshwater marsh, and then there's this pretty small tidal forested wetland, tidal swamp, and I just happened to take this picture in the same place. Oops, sorry. You can see some of these trees are dead. This is not the greatest picture. There's also a non-wetland forest behind it that you might see. So here's another picture of it. But these are the ash trees, which were really the tallest trees in this forest. There's some other shorter red maples and black gums. And behind it, you can actually see the non-wetland forest behind it that had other non-wetland species. Before the canopy died back, we were doing some other things here. We fortuitously set up these litter traps. So we were collecting leaf litter because we were looking at carbon inputs to this wetland. And you can see here, it's pretty dark, like the other pictures, pretty shaded. There's some open areas. There is vegetation, shrubby vegetation, some herbaceous plants on the hummocks, but a lot of bare open areas. Excuse me. And then in 2016, we really saw that this canopy was really completely gone. There's not really a way of really describing it. There were some scattered, shorter red maples, poison ivy. We've heard how important and great poison ivy is. Well, it's going to do even better, at least until the trees fall over. So it likes the light. So there's a lot of light. What Chris said is absolutely right. This is going to be a huge loss of these trees, massive amounts of light in an area that's very, very shaded. And this actually, at this site on the Patuxent, caused a rapid change in the understory vegetation. Now the trees, the shrubs that are there, the smaller trees, there's some like a couple of smaller species, tall shrubs. They didn't change much in that time, but what we did see, there were these annual plants. You saw the picture of the marsh that was right nearby. A lot of these species have seeds that are water dispersed that had washed in there. Things like the burr marigolds and beggar's ticks, those little things you get stuck on your clothes and you can't get them off. The wetland species of those seeds can last in wetlands for decades or even centuries. So they were in there or had washed in, and you got this massive seedling recruitment, mostly in the hollows, the lower parts. That's a similar elevation to the marsh. The hummock species, sort of the ferns, sedges, ashes, other wildflowers you see that grow on those were there, but these other plants grew so tall, there was so much light, so many nutrients, plenty of water, starting to overshadow those plants and may cause some of them to be outcompeted. And there were a lot of these shrubs that were still there. They may or may not increase, but I would imagine they might increase some. One thing we did see is that a lot of the ash trees, although the canopy died back, the trees weren't actually dead. Most of them weren't dead. A lot of them had these basal sprouts. So this is actually an ash tree. Here's somebody standing on one of our boardwalks with massive basal sprouts coming out. That looked great. So it's unknown how long these things will really stick around. I don't know what's going to happen with that, but that's a symptom of the ash borer. It restricts, it girdles the tree. There's no connection of water and nutrients flowing to and from the leaves, so they respond by sending out these shoots from the roots. So that may be a mechanism for regeneration of this species. We actually then we had some plots set up, and we measured in these plots, we looked at how many of these trees just last year were living and had basal sprouts, and about 70% of the trees were still alive. Okay? However, those trees, we used a canopy condition index. Out of the 70 trees we looked at, 62 were in this category 5. Canopy has no leaves. Epicormic sprouts may be present on the trunk. And very few of those had that. So the trees were alive, but they were just all these sort of shrubs. They were like big shrubs. With those leaf litter traps and with clipping plots, we had clipped plots of herbaceous plant material. This gives you an idea in terms of carbon cycling or material debris processing in the wetland. If you look at here, herbaceous above ground biomass, so we just took a square plot, clipped it all off, and dried it and weighed it. Yes?
I have a question for the previous slide.
Oh, yeah.
Of those 5 trees that basically were unaffected, were they intermixed or were they an island someplace?
Well, they were very, very small. They weren't tall canopy trees. All the tall trees were gone. And so it was just, there were 1 or 2, I would say, maybe an inch and a half diameter tree, young ones. No, we haven't seen that yet, but that's something that we want to note. If there are these, they call them lingering ash, because if there are some trees that are persisting, that could be really valuable, of course, for regeneration or restoration of ash in these forests. But that's a good point. We have a good amount of information here. I'm just showing you a little bit. I haven't even analyzed most of it yet, but mostly it was just the whole canopy. You really didn't see any ash trees that had a full canopy that were tall trees. So here, this herbaceous plant biomass, it was very shady. This is about 4 grams of dry weight in a meter squared in this much area, which is about an ounce of material. You know, like an ounce of marijuana. That's it for a whole square meter. Give you guys something to relate to, you know? No, I'm sure that's not going on here. But just in this 1 year, the next year we had a plot, the same place, 450 grams, which is about a pound of material in this square meter. And it was mostly these burr marigolds, which are beautiful plants. You see them flowering in October. These are actually flowering even earlier on, these flowers. And there's some that don't have the showy flowers. There's the terrathums you see that are out there. So a lot of diversity of plants coming in. Wetland marsh plants, but a large increase in that, and then a real decrease in how much woody plant litter. So these were leaves that fell into these traps that we had last fall versus over this past fall versus the fall before. And so we went from about 205 grams in a square meter down to 33. And if you add those up, we go from about 200 grams of dry mass in a square meter to almost 500. So 2.5 times more production, primary production, which is an indicator of ecosystem function, nutrient cycling, biomass production. Now, there are also all these trees that are standing there that are starting to fall, and that's going to do something else. There's going to be all this carbon going in from those trees. But this is just living production cycling, so more photosynthesis going on. So what does this really mean for the eastern shore? That's the western shore. That has started. Of course, that site is not that far from where emerald ash borer was first introduced to Maryland, which was in PG County. It goes maybe 1 or 2 miles a year, and in about that much time, it got over to where this site was. The bay is slowing it down, but it's over here now, and how fast will it go? I don't think anybody knows when this thing is going to explode. I haven't heard anybody say that. Maybe somebody has a good idea. But one of our sites that Jonathan and Diane and I were looking at the other day, this is on the Tuckahoe River in Hillsborough, and there's this nice little park, and there's a huge ash-dominated wetland right there. So the folks, it occurred to me, when they see this, and they've been going here year after year, and all of a sudden they see that the vast majority of the trees are dead, it's got to be a real shock. I don't think people realize that this is going to happen. It's going to change this landscape, that what people see. So you're going to probably hear more about it. You'll probably see it at some point. I don't know when it'll be, but it'll probably be soon. So let me see if I'm going too long. So I will say that ash in these systems, it's not 1 in 5. I don't know if it's 1 in 5. It's the most dominant tree in these systems. Maybe that's 1 in 5, but it's at higher density than any of the other trees. Really, the only other significant trees that we have in this Nanticoke system is red maple and black gum. There's an occasional Atlantic white cedar there. These other things are really shrubs or small trees. They're maybe classified as trees because they're bigger than an inch diameter. So you get an idea of how big these areas are. And we haven't seen any major dieback yet. And Jonathan, outstanding in his field, the old joke. But if we had seen that, we would have seen. He's not afraid to go out in the mud and get his feet wet or dirty. This is Diane, who couldn't be here today, but we went looking for study sites. We would have seen a lot more understory evidence of understory growth if these canopies had died, and we don't see any of the signs on the trees, like the split bark, the branching, the basal sprouts. So we didn't see it. I haven't heard any reports, but if you hear anything, you should let somebody know if you see things that look like it's starting to die, they only have 2 traps in each county. You might see it before we do. One thing is these sites do have these other species, and a question is, what will these other species do? These are red maple, which is already flowering. You can't really see it there, but we can see the flowers. Atlantic white cedar, some other species, baldcypress, that could come in and take the place, but they don't maybe grow as well in these really flooded systems as the ash do. They're not as tall. A lot of uncertainties, like him in this visit. But will these things be able to persist via the sprouts? Are there these lingering ash there? Will these lingering or sprouts produce seeds? Is there seedling recruitment? Do any of these other species, could they become the new dominant species? Will we lose these hummocks? Will the hummocks, if there aren't any trees, will the hummocks sink or decompose, go away? Will we get invasives like the Phragmites, multiflora rose, honeysuckles coming in if it's not too wet? And so this could really alter the whole ecosystem. The microtopography, which affects the hydrology, also. One thing that's a question mark is accretion and subsidence with sea level rise. If there's a lack of roots there, will this sink more quickly? Will something happen? We have more organic matter going in, more production, but what will that do to just the structure underneath the marsh? Will they be able to keep up with sea level rise? Because if they can't, you could have a conversion to a marsh or to an open water, and that could affect some of these functions that we might think are associated with forested systems. So I think with that, I would say we need to do research to understand this. We're trying to start research. If you have funding and wish to support some very important research, we're looking for funding now. We're trying to pull together funding. Basically just summarizes the things that I was talking about. That we're going to have this massive disturbance. We're going to have this loss of this ash, a cascading effect on the ecosystem, and there's a lot of uncertainty. So I don't think anybody can really say with certainty what is going to happen. It may not be that bad. We might be able to maintain woods, but when you have the dominant species going, it's kind of we don't know what's going to happen. Okay, thank you very much.